Welcome to Superhero Pow. I'm your host nerd, Tom Friendly. And it's time once again for another Raiders of the Long Box, where we dig into our comic book collection and celebrate comic books of days gone by. This time it's one of the most interesting comic books of all time, really. And I don't mean this from like a writing or an artistic point of view. I mean the circumstances involved in the creation of the comic book, as it was sabotaged by Jimmy Carter and then bungled by the three writers, while setting up the future of how comic books would be sold. Just what the hell am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about 1982's Marvel Superhero Contest of Champions. Now, there's just so much to talk about with this book, I'm not even sure where to begin, so I suppose at the risk of dragging it out, I'm just going to go in chronological order, because that's just how unimaginative I am. The story supposedly starts in 1979. The world was getting ready for the Olympic Games happening in 1980, with the Winter Games happening in Lake Placid and the Summer Games happening in Moscow. Yes, they both used to take place in the same year. And Marvel Comics got the idea to have a comic book tying into the Olympics. A superhero Olympics. Sounds like a no-brainer. Well, as they were putting plans together, Jimmy Carter, the American president, decided after we had whipped the USSR in hockey, we would boycott the Summer Olympic Games in Moscow. This was because of all the shenanigans the USSR was doing in Afghanistan. Everything old is new again. Anyway, that basically killed the Marvel Superhero Olympics. But somebody still thought it was a good idea. Probably the writer Mark Gruenwald, who in 1981 got to work on revising the story so that it would see print in 1982 as Marvel Superhero Contest of Champions. Now, originally this was meant to be published as a Marvel Treasury. You know, their tabloid-sized comics. While most of those were reprints, some, like The Marvelous Land of Oz and Captain America's Bicentennial Battles, were news stories. And they even managed to publish a Winter Olympics one, too. Marvel Treasury number 25, Spider-Man vs. the Hulk at the Winter Olympics, which was written by the same guys who would write Contest of Champions. But by 1982, the tabloid-sized comics were basically done. Batman vs. the Hulk in 1981 was basically the last one, as 1982's X-Men Teen Titans crossover was just your typical sized comic book, which, was a shame because could you imagine? Anyway, Marvel needed a new format to sell this story, and following DC Comics' lead, as they did with tabloid-sized comics, Marvel published their first limited series, and basically never looked back again. As the direct market was starting to really grow and comic book stores were becoming a thing, it was now possible to sell a limited series, which didn't really work too well in the ordering process of the old newspaper stands. So Contest of Champions became a 3-issue limited series. Now, where Spider-Man and the Hulk's Olympic adventure was really just them crashing the course, Contest of Champions was giving the readers more of what they really wanted. Superhero versus superhero action. But this was a game, not the typical misunderstanding slugfest. Now, before I jump into the issues, let's talk about the creators. First and foremost is Mark Gruenwald, whose nearly 20 years at Marvel, before an untimely death, was simply remarkable. Basically creating Quasar, having one of the most successful New Universe books with DP7, writing the Squadron Supreme miniseries, and over 100 issues of Captain America, plus something pretty big that I'll mention later, was the main driving force of this book. Helping him were other Marvel stewards like Bill Mantlo and Stephen Grant. Doing the art was John Romita Jr., but this was before he adopted his famous style. And it was all being inked a little heavily by Pablos Marcos, who made it look like the typical Marvel comic book at the time. All right, let's get into the story. And no, I haven't forgotten to tell you how it was bungled. we're getting to that. Issue number 1 is just superhero porn. And by that I mean it's just pictures of every superhero in the Marvel Universe, pretty much, as they've all been gathered up into a giant space arena by an Elder of the Universe, the Grandmaster. And the dialogue is fairly hilarious here too, as each character is trying to identify themselves or the one next to them and mention their powers at the same time. It's kind of like, even though my name is Bloodhound, my dog-like powers can't determine where I am right now. You know, typical, normal, everyday conversation stuff, right? Anyway, the Grandmaster has paralyzed everybody on the planet Earth and has demanded that the heroes play his game with another entity of the universe, now just known as the Unknown, or else he will never free the people of Earth. The heroes begrudgingly agree, and then the Grandmaster and the Unknown pick teams. After the 12-man teams have been picked, with some women, the teams are broken up into 4 groups of 3, each to compete against each other and search for one of 4 quarters of a golden globe. The team who recovers the most quarters wins. Moving on to issue number 2, the games begin. And while there's really no good reason for these 2 teams not to work together, because, whoever wins, the Earth gets freed, they still start slugging it out anyway. In the frozen Arctic, Sunfire, the Invisible Woman, and Iron Fist take on Daredevil, Darkstar, and newly created for this series, Talisman. No, not her, him. Meanwhile, in an old western ghost town, Iron Man, the Arabian Knight, and Saber take on She-Hulk, Captain Britain, pre-Alan Davis's makeover, and the newly created for this series, Defensor. This issue was big on fights, and that's pretty much all there was to it. Now the last issue, number 3. Near China's City of the Dead, Angel, Black Panther, and Vanguard, the Soviet superhero, take on Wolverine, The Thing, and, newly created for this series, Le Peregrine. Then, somewhere in a South American rainforest, Captain America, Sasquatch, and the newly created for this series, Blitzkrieg, take on Storm and the newly created for this series, Collective Man and Shamrock. Yes, they created 6 new global heroes for this series, most of which who have never been seen again. But now we've come to the blunder, which, in order to explain, I have to give away big spoilers, all right? So, here I go. So, Shamrock on the Unknown's team manages to defeat Captain America and get a Golden Globe piece, then claims victory for Grandmaster. What the heck? She's on the Unknown's team? How the heck do you screw this up, Grunewald? Well, the blunder does get fixed in reprints with some new dialogue claiming that the game was a tie. And it doesn't matter too much because, as the Unknown is revealed, she basically cheats the Grandmaster, making it a dark victory. After that, the Earth is freed, and the heroes all go back to their lives. What a ride. Well, as you can tell, the story really wasn't that spectacular, but it gets the job done well enough, and the fights are all pretty good. I think editor Jim Shooter was even taking notes because, in a roundabout way, the more popular Secret Wars that he wrote is basically the same setup, just adding villains into the mix. As for the artwork, it's all pretty good, especially these half 2-page spreads, and the big arena shot is pretty cool too. While this is kind of commonplace now in crossover events, this one is kind of like the first one ever. Also, Mark Grunewald did something extra cool in the back of these books. The typical editorial pages were replaced with a who's who of the Marvel superheroes, listing 195 active and inactive or deceased superheroes. So this book is really a must-have for any Marvel or just any superhero fan. And as you might have guessed already, this is totally a precursor to Mark's other big achievement, producing the official handbook of the Marvel Universe the following year. The man truly loved comics. All right, before I go, let's check out some of these old ads. Here's one for the next limited series, Hercules. Dungeons and Dragons comic book style ad, Cracker Jack, Lifesavers Maze, Captain O and his sell crap for prizes ad, or you could just try to sell that crappy magazine Grit instead. A perennial Mile High Comics ad, and even a G.I. Joe fan club, whose first Marvel comic came out the same month as Contest of Champions #1 came out. And here's all the usual fun junk as well. Well, there you have it. Do you have this little gem in your collection? Maybe if they had gotten John Byrne or, dare I say, George Perez to draw it, even though he had left for DC 2 years earlier, Contest of Champions would have been a much bigger deal. As it is, it seems almost a little forgotten. Anyway, thanks for spending time with me. And if you could be so kind to like, subscribe, and notify, I promise not to go over to your place and try to sell you life insurance. But really, have you thought about it? I've got a brochure here